Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Bonnie Mills, and I'm Generation Citizens Manager of National Program and Partnership Development. Really excited to be joined today by one of our GC veteran teachers, who I'm going to let introduce herself now.
My name is Deirdre Doughty. I am a teacher at an early college high school in Bastrop, Texas. I also teach history classes at our partner community college, Austin Community College. I teach GC to freshman students in this class that really facilitates teaching GC called Social Studies Research Methods. So I have a lot of flexibility, and that may be, so GC may look a little different in my classroom, but I love it, and I'm excited to share with you guys anything that I can to help it be successful for you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Deirdre. We're so excited to get to learn from your insight and perspective and share that with our new GC teachers. I'm sure it's going to be super helpful. We're going to focus primarily today on asking you questions about the research phase and then the actual action phase where teachers and students, are implementing their plan. So I'm just going to kick us off with this first one, which is just, if someone were to come into your class during the action phase when they're implementing their plan, what would they see and hear and experience? What would it be like?
Okay, well, this is really my favorite part of the whole, well, actually, I can think of a few favorite parts. So what about the whole DC process? It varies a little bit between classes, but in general, what an observer would see is lots of noise, or hear lots of noise. See, at least for some students, a lot of movement. So students are getting up to go check in with other groups. Some students are out in the hallway making phone calls. Some students are in a corner of the room practicing their scripts. In general, if it's going well, there's a level of high energy in the room that maybe in the beginning, especially if you're not used to that kind of activity, can be a little bit, can seem like it's chaos, but it's really manageable chaos. And it's one of the things that I love about it. It's a student's favorite part, that aside from going to Civics Day. So it's an exciting part of the program.
Well, so you've kind of touched on this a little bit already. If you could tell us a little bit of like, what are students doing during action and what are you doing during action?
So students during action are in groups. They are working on whatever tasks their group is centered on. So I have found that surveys, for example, are super helpful. So we'll have a student survey group. I have another group that feels comfortable making phone calls. And so that group will be, there's a template for a script for phone calls that students find quite helpful, but they tailor that template to match their target. So you'll see students either writing their script or practicing their script, or the big exciting and scary part for some students, calling people. I usually like to film that aspect of it, just so the students have something to look back on, and it helps them to record the feedback that they get. You'll also see some students doing research online, very important part of the process, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit, research in particular. That overall those are just some of the examples of what students might be doing. Some students are writing emails, so that's a big part of it too. It's often difficult to get through to people by phone, although that's our preferred method. I find that the students react to that best. So email writing as well. As far as me, if I'm not filming a phone call, I am checking in on students, making sure that they are on task, because they don't always stay on task, as we know. But so I redirect. There's often lots of questions, especially for those writing emails, and in particular doing the phone calls, lots of questions about, am I doing this right? Am I wording this right? I will listen to them practice their phone call scripts and help them, in fact, be one of the targets, so they get some experience with that. But basically, I'm checking in on the students, monitoring them. But I do want to stress that it's really important. One of the things that's so great about GC is that the students themselves are leading this, and they need to own their work. So I'm just a facilitator, monitoring what the students are doing.
You sort of touched on this a little bit too, but I know, so as a former classroom teacher, and I hear this a lot from classroom teachers, you know, group work is just always challenging in general. And especially, I know sometimes teachers have a hard time with the fact that not only is there group work going on, but there's such varied tasks taking place. So do you have just any tips for like how you make sure that while you're working with the kids that are practicing phone calls, the other kids are still doing this and getting what they need or whatever?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, the Generation Citizen curriculum has in each student guide a research log. So it's super important. You have to stay on top of this, and the students don't always stay on top of this themselves, but it's key that they know what they're going to be doing for the day.
Right.
So just making sure that the students have filled in their research log, which person in the group is doing what part of that task is important to make sure that you start off the day doing that. When it comes to particular activities that help, since in the action phase, students are contacting targets. We keep the names and the contact info of all of our targets on a big sheet of picture paper up on the whiteboard, and I rotate them depending on which class is going is in my classroom at that time. That's super helpful. The students are constantly looking up at the wall to see what's that person's name again, and what's the phone number, what's the email. So that's a important thing. So I think that one thing that I really want to stress, as far as the action goes, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, it's when students connect with live people that they have the most reaction to what they're doing. And so I really stress them making phone calls, because then they're actually talking to somebody and getting actual live interaction from them. Now, that said, it's often hard to get a hold of some of the targets. These are busy, important people. But the other important thing to know is that often the staff of the targets are super helpful. And my students have gotten lots of really helpful information from staff members and various legislators, for example, or district administrators. I also would like to highlight the fact that guest speakers, I was just talking with Juanita, she stressed that she used to have multiple guest speakers. You don't just have to have one guest speaker. That's another point of contact where students are actually talking to a real live person, and it's just transformative to have people come into your room and talk to them. So I would suggest thinking about guest speakers early on and getting as many people in as you can, because again, it's the live interactions that are super key. Just kind of another thing that's not maybe quite related, but in terms of research, one of the more difficult types of target to locate are community organizations or advocacy groups. And one of my colleagues actually noted that if you go to the city website, for example, or the state website, they will have a list of community partners, and that's a really good place to look for community advocacy groups that can be influencers for your decision makers. And that actually helps me remember one of the other points that I think it's important that the students know, and maybe the teachers new to this know as well, is that the vast majority of people that students will be contacting, they want to help. They they're excited to be talking to young people. And so students, I think if they know that ahead of time, because they get so nervous. If they know that people, there's something about that student voice that makes people in less accessible positions more accessible, and they want to help. They want to be working with young people. So that's a key thing, I think, to stress to students. Well, and then in the research part of it, this is a phase that can be difficult for many students, at least my student population, they don't have experience in doing research. They're not really, in some ways, developmentally ready. So it's something that I have to really break down into small steps for them to begin just even understanding the terms that they need to be looking for, where they look for research. But so I think teachers overall need to be aware that at least depending on your student population, you'll need to scaffold a lot. And that can be a little bit difficult to manage if you've got 4 different classes, each with a different topic, in an area that you've never yourself looked into.
Right.
And so one thing that I have to remind myself to do is to look at the Weebly. Generation System has a Weebly. A lot of topics, for example, let's say on immigration or substance abuse, there are websites listed there, and depending on your area in the US, sometimes even targets, influencers, those sorts of decision makers, people. So do check the Weebly, but also as a teacher, you may, and you probably will, have to do research on your own. And I find it's helpful to do that kind of ahead of the students doing that, so that you're able to better guide them.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I'm often curious. I think it does vary across teachers and classrooms, but I'm often curious about what is the teacher doing prior to research. You know, and we have suggestions in the curriculum of like, here are some things that you can do to prepare. But again, I think it does vary. So it sounds like you do some of the research in advance, which I think probably other teachers do too. It is helpful, like, especially when your students are covering new stuff, like you want to stay a couple days ahead of them if possible. But do you provide any of the research that you find to them, or do you help teach them how to find the types of things that you've found?
My plan next year is to go through and give them the tools that they need to do research. So key terms, what website should you use? What kinds of questions should you be asking? But kind of help guiding them to figure that out for themselves, but at the same time kind of giving them a template for that. And then starting off with an article that I have found that we will all go through together, and then look at the article itself. Because one of the things that's really hard for the students is knowing, once they found an article, if there's information in it that's helpful for them. And so I think if we go through an article, and I did this past semester, if we go through the article together and say, okay, where are they talking about a decision maker? Where are they talking about an influencer? Where are they talking about root cause? Where are they talking about a tactic? Where are they talking about community advocacy groups, that sort of thing? Then it helps the students to understand what those words mean. That's a big lot of them.
Okay, I'm trying to think. I feel like we've covered almost everything. I'm wondering, just a couple of sort of lingering thoughts that I have. One is, do you have students doing sort of the classic thing? I say classic, this happened to me all the time. I think it happens to other teachers, where they're like, I'm finished. I don't have anything else to do. And if so, how do you tackle that? How do you work students through that?
Yes, I absolutely do have students doing that. The ways that I've handled that are, in some cases, they actually have finished the task that their group was assigned to do. And so or their task for the day within their group, I will see if other groups need help working on something else. As we get closer to the end of to Civics Day, actually, one thing that a lot of students like to do is to work on the board. And so I will either have them work on the creative aspect of that, or write up a little summary of what they have done, so that the people working on the board can include that on the board. So really, those are my two main things: to look in another group and see if there are tasks that students need help with there, or to have them in some way work on the board, either by helping students who are working on the board or having them themselves do that. Another thing that you can have students do is it's always important to send thank you letters to people that you've contacted. So that's a good, relatively easy task for students to do, that people who say that they are done with everything, they can be doing that.
Oh, I love that point. I'm so glad you brought up thank you notes. I totally agree. One other thing that I just thought of that I've seen a teacher do before, and this really gets at what you were saying, like a group that might still have some tasks or need help, is just like sort of do what you said that you did, where you like pretend to be the target. So like they'd help play out sort of the phone calls, or even like offer some thoughts about an email draft that they've written, you know, doing some peer editing or things like that too. So. Oh yeah, sure. One more question. How did you go about grouping your students, both during the research phase and also the action phase? I mean, if it was different or similar, you know, you can share both.
Right. In general, what I have done is have the students on a exit ticket list the 2 areas or groups that they are most interested in working with, and then give that to me. And then I spread them all out on my desk and figure out, I try to put people in the spots that they want, but I also look at who I think is going to work best together.
Right.
And so really it's a mix of that. And that's why I have them list their top 2, so that at least I can hopefully get them into one of their first choices. And then, you know, there are times, and there are some groups, there's some classes when even once we've started the group work, where I may need to do a little rearranging depending on who's being productive or not. I will say this was something that I was really pleased with this last semester. Students, at the end of this semester, I had them do a kind of a reflection piece. That's actually part of the curriculum too. And many students talked about how much they'd like the collaborative aspect of GC, and that they'd really gotten a lot out of that. So it may look like groups aren't working sometimes, but I think a lot of students get a lot of benefit from it, and ultimately like it.
Oh, that's a lovely point. Thank you for reminding us of that. Well, this has been so helpful, Deirdre. I so appreciate it. If you had any sort of like final words for a teacher, if you were at a PD or you were talking to a teacher, especially like a new one that might be a little nervous, what might be sort of your final words of encouragement to them?
Okay, I can think of 2 things that I would say.
Okay.
One is that, at least for me, there will be a point in the semester where you think, this is never going to come together. But it does. Believe me, it totally does. So if you're feeling like you just don't know how it's all going to turn out, just keep in mind that it will come together. And the other thing that I want to stress that isn't always evident right from the outset is that GC, I literally have had students tell me or say, after they've spoken with someone on the phone or had a guest speaker say, a quote from one student last semester was, "We feel like we can change the world," and other people saying, "I didn't think they would listen to us," and they did. And I mean, the amount of confidence they get from being recognized and having their voices heard is so powerful, and you can see this transformation, and that is wonderful. So that is the ultimate goal and benefit of GC, and I'm excited for new teachers to see that in their students.
Oh, yes, I totally agree. That is wonderful. Well, thank you again, Deirdre. I so appreciate it. I know our teachers are too.
Yay, thank you. I'm excited for everybody.